resource extraction is an incredibly lucrative form of resource, incredibly lucrative form of investment. At the point at which you take out tons from the ground, that is enough to power your company for a long, long, long time. And especially in a world in which we are so based on those resources, for example, lithium, for example, coal, for example, steel, iron, stuff like that. Well, you don't get steel from the ground, but iron's really important for that. What that means is that a lot of the time, this is quite profitable, irrespective of the way that you will do it. However, we're going to push the margins further for developing nations where there are some deficits in the way that they create their deals and where there are some small pernicious incentives to behave badly when it comes to resource extraction, which harms the economy. The first thing I'm going to do with this setup is simply just to explain that developing nations' interests are not the government's interests, it's the interests of the population, and we are probably, in this debate, I think also governments still have some incentive to be quite aligned with the population for a number of reasons. The first is that, obviously, in order to make sure that that government stays in power, they need to reduce dissent as much as possible. Like, obviously, there's dissent through the ballot, through votes. Like, it's quite bad for the Thai government that people have voted against them through Thai, but also it's important to maintain non-dissent through people not writing and getting angry. For example, even though it is quite totalitarian, even Sri Lanka would probably want to avoid dissent. But also, secondly, the government is quite aligned with the population because people inside government, even though they might sometimes come from privileged places, understand that development is really important for that country because they have seen that country suffer. They are a part of that country. And thirdly, the government probably does care about the population simply because it is a way that government enhances itself and politicians enhance themselves on this world stage. You want to see that people prosper, people listen to you more, your economy is stronger, and that gives you more power in the region, more power generally, which is the reason why often you will make decisions on the basis of actual good development for your population. The first question I'm going to ask is how are deals formed and who gets better deals as a result? What is the element of a good deal, guys? The first thing is that you obviously need appropriate pay for the amounts that is extracted. A deal must be commensurate to the thing that is being done. But also, a deal must benefit the state and benefit these developing nations especially because these resources need to be put to good use because it's only one of the few things that they actually have. They're not service economies like Australia, so it's very important that their resources get bang for its buck. Every single microgram of this resource needs to extract as much money as possible. So that is what a good deal is. It actually pushes the envelope of how much this government is going to get as a result. Let's talk about why we get appropriate pay as a result of these deals under our side. Firstly, I'm going to talk about a fixed rate and how the deals are made as a result. Usually there's an asymmetry of power between developing nation governments and MNCs, like BP oil. And the reason is because, A, a lot of these developing nations just need anyone to come in and actually extract anything, because that gets money through the door. If the comparative is no one comes in, then often that means that is destitution for your people. But B, a lot of these corporations are backed by even bigger governments, for example, the United States, and they have an interest to ensure that their corporations succeed and actually get a lot of resources. But also, thirdly, there are other reason why there is an asymmetry in power between developing nations and MNCs is because MNCs may at times honestly, they at times just give the option of either, actually, that reason doesn't matter. Either way, you know that there's a bit of an asymmetry. What is the result? The result is twofold. Firstly, it means that you can push the fixed rate or fixed fee down as a result. Because often these corporations can say, well, if you're not going to take this on, then you aren't going to get us at all. And often they have to capitulate. The opposition may say, well, often it's likely that there is competition between corporations in creating the deals. The deals are so awesome, but the problem is that, one, often the kind of competition is quite small. That is because often in order to do resource extraction, you need a lot of liquidity, especially if you are going to pay this fixed fee. So there's both the startup cost and the fixed fee as well. You need to be a large corporation to do this. That therefore means that very few actors are actually in the market to actually compete with these deals. But secondly, a lot of corporations are oligopolistic. What that looks like is that they don't go on each other's turf and territory. So that is that if one corporation is marketing to Sri Lanka, that another big corporation will not interfere in that space. They'll go to somewhere else. Because if they start competing with one another, they know that there'll be a race to the bottom. That is that they shrink their own profits. So it's better to diversify from whom you are actually going to be extracting deals from. So that therefore means that in the decision of making a deal, it is probably not going to be competitive. But secondly, not only do they they just push the fixed fee down, but they can also lowball the profit estimates, and often they do this in quite, seemingly good ways, or sometimes there's actually an incentive to make sure that you are being quite conservative in terms of the estimates that you'll have. That is that we will not extract this much, or the extraction that we do in this current market will not get us that much profit. So as a result, the negotiations fall in favor of corporations to push the fee down. And like these governments aren't going to be like, oh, you're being pernicious, you're being nasty and mean and money hungry. Often it's like, okay, fair enough, you won't actually make those profits. And the big corporations usually have better data to know whether or not that's actually going to be profitable, and they present that to those governments, and those governments often give in. The comparative then is that there's no capacity to hide and obfuscate from what you'll be paying. This is a profit tax, which means that you'll be taxed on the basis of how much you make. And from country to country, it will be different. But often, it is quite a substantial tax because it is necessary to ensure you actually get value as a nation from that resource extraction. Because it's the only way. Whatever. So the second thing we deal with is economic profit for developing nations. Now, we increase the amount of investment under our side for two main reasons. The first is because under a fixed fee system, firms, especially medium-sized and multinational corporations, don't invest. For the mechanism that I gave you before about why it can only be super large MNCs. What that means is that, and that's because there's a tax that is, the tax of the fixed fee is a deterrent. That is, shareholders are reticent to do the startup cost and also pay the fixed fee. What changes now is that you only pay the fixed fee and you get profits, but you also get some of that profit being taken out of, yes, by the developing nation. But you still get a lot of profit initially. So that therefore means you increase the number of actors who want to be a part of this. This leads to, one, more extraction in these countries, which therefore means more money going to these countries as a result. But it also means more goods and services are made necessarily in these developing nations because there are just more resources to make those things, which reduces the price of all the products that are needed in those countries, like medical equipment and all the like that. And that is important in this debate. But also, secondly, you increase competition between these corporations. That is, that it is good for states to choose between those who would benefit the most. They will select the particular corporation that will do them the best. That is, and the status quo, unfortunately, they do not have that privilege because that is quite limited in who can actually be selected. Let's talk about the environment now. We think that if a corporation takes a fixed rate, we think that they are probably needing to recoup those costs quite quickly for two main reasons. The first is because often debt obligations mean that you have a legal obligation to pay them, but also there is a necessity to pay them quickly. It is a market signal that you should invest in us. We can pay our debt quite quickly, even though we did this immense startup cost. So the incentive is to extract quick and fast. The incentive is to fill in the black hole covered by startup costs and the fixed fee. Compared to our side, yes, there's some extraction that is quick and fast on the basis of simply trying to fix the startup costs and plug that hole, but there is no fixed fee initially. There is no black hole in terms of how much the government is taking from you. So that means that on the basis of profit, you are that is where you're taxed. You're not taxed before that, so there's no incentive to be over-extracted. The conclusion of this debate is that usually there is competition in a market where that market is important. But if we can move the envelope further for competition, we win the debate.
Ready? When Jez says that developing countries should get the biggest bang for their buck with their resources, we completely agree. This is a team that supports resource profit taxes, a form of tax that disincentivizes businesses to make profit, to get that exact bang for the buck, and generates way more risk-averse behavior about the ways that businesses go about generating profit. i.e., they're far more likely to do certain profit-maximizing actions, like, for instance, exploiting their workforce, paying them less, deregulating labor regulations, rather than more speculative forms of generating profit. Things like increasing the efficiency with capital-intensive investments in their production line, things which may in fact reduce land use, which may in fact reduce the environmental harms of resource extraction, which this team has to shoulder. Our case is very basic. Firstly, the rationale for these taxes becomes nonsensical when you index them to profit rather than how much resource harm occurs. Secondly, that is less and more harmful profit in the affirmative team's world. And thirdly, this exacerbates state capture by corporations by virtue of the fact that they have the opportunity to pay retrospectively after they have already extracted rather than paying upfront, which exacerbates harms that will already be established earlier in the case. Okay, let's get to why property taxes or resource extraction are fundamentally irrational. Taxing resource extraction specifically is usually justified on two grounds. First, that they generate negative externalities, i.e. they poison or harm water supplies, they make land less viable for use for other resources, they do things like deforestation. There's often the argument that communities should be compensated for that harm. But we would make the claim that negative externalities of resource extraction do not scale to profit, and the opposite is almost always true. Because if you become more efficient, i.e. use less land, but use that land more efficiently, you can gain more profit because you're able to, for each unit, gain more profit. But additionally, things like if you invest in capital to have a more efficient and complex production line, that makes it more likely that you gain profit. But also, that means that you generate less negative externalities. For instance, you can do something like carbon capture, which is more capital intensive, but helps you gain profit. Which means that in their world, they are justifying a tax which is irrational. They are not compensating for negative externalities. They are in fact punishing people for gaining profit, which would in fact reduce negative externalities. Secondly, they repay communities for their losses, because if you think that resources are nationally owned, as definitely First Affirmative appears to believe, that it's unclear why it is that harm of having that resource mined and extracted by a different corporation scales to the profit that corporation earns. The value is about the nature of the resource. It is not about the fact that it is being extracted for a certain profit, which also makes this tax irrational. We think it's absolutely far more rational to do something sensible, like the harm that happens is from how much land is used and how that land is used, which is far more closely indexed to what resource royalties index, which is how much land is used and how much you are buying from the government to use it. Okay, why is it uneconomical to do resource profit taxes? For a couple of reasons. Firstly, this very basically disincentivizes businesses from making a profit, because the marginal benefit of further profit becomes less. And it becomes not as likely that you put in the effort to gain extra profit because you'll be taxed highly, and the invoice size suggests significantly more than you otherwise would be for that profit. And the impact of that on the debate is just actually very basic. Like, when businesses make surpluses, that is beneficial for the people who work for them. And that is overarchingly in developing countries with resource extraction, people who live in those countries, they create jobs, they create higher wages for the people who work for those corporations. They make it more appealing for other companies to go and invest in that developing country in industries entirely apart from resource extraction, because they see the profit line that businesses make in those nations and say, well, I can make a lot of profit in this nation, and it makes it more likely that they enter that nation compared to a different one, which means the developing countries' overall industries are harmed by the fact that these businesses make less profit. But even if you're going to get the rebuttal, of course businesses will still want to make profit, we will contend that when they want to make profit, they'll do so in ways that are much, much more harmful for developing countries. Because, specifically, profit taxes deter riskier ways of gaining profit and promote businesses to go less risky ways of obtaining profit, as I presaged in the introduction. For instance, it is very certain that if you pay your workers less, you exploit them, make them work harder for longer time periods, and work at lobbying, for instance, for lower workplace conditions, you will get more profit because you are paying your labor less. That is a certain way to obtain your profit. But there are more speculative ways to obtain profit, which we contend are far more likely in the world that we use, where you can gain, for instance, where there is resource royalties. Because, as I already stated, there are capital-intensive and speculative ways of generating profit. For instance, in lithium processing, a low-technology version of doing it is large open ponds which use a lot of resources, and can be quite damaging to the human communities that rely on that water. But you can mechanize it in a way that reduces the amount of land that is used and therefore actually makes it more efficient. That is speculative because it requires you to invest in a technology that might fail, and it also is quite capital intensive in the way that it is done. In our world, with a resource royalty, you are benefited from that because you're using less land for how much you are extracting, and you're still gaining the profit. In their world, this is disincentivized because it is comparatively more speculative, and you wouldn't want to take the risk if you're going to be taxed for your profit, which means they massively increase the likelihood of bad profit gaining mechanisms and decrease the likelihood of good profit gaining mechanisms. We think resource royalties are independently far superior for 3 reasons. Firstly, because they create the incentive to use resources efficiently, as I have already described, which works by the same mechanism. Like, you can do lots of environmentally damaging large land use practices that gain profit. We say it becomes less likely in our world because you're trying to maximize the amount of profit you can gain from small land use, which damages the environment less. But secondly, because you can plan, you get the money up front with a resource royalty, you get it after they have already mined in their wood. And the amount of money you gain is certain. Even if it is less money, you know how much money you're getting. You can plan, you can put it in funds, you can invest in people. When you have to rely on speculative profits that maybe aren't reported to you until the point they pay the tax, you cannot plan for that. It becomes incredibly hard to actually invest in people. So even if it's aggregately less, it's still beneficial. And finally, we flip the autonomy of choice. You have far more agency if you are selling a contract to someone rather than just simply allowing them in and saying, well, if you come in, you do this program, which allows us to create more autonomy. The weighing of this is, I think, quite straightforward. If exploitation is equal, more money made in profit in our world, which is a benefit for people who work in these industries and in developing countries. If it's true that environmental damage is extremely bad for developing nations, which we think it is because it destroys communities and sometimes damages their core goods like their water supply, people should be compensated, which means why we want more surplus, but also we explain that it reduces the incentive to harm these communities and to invest in ways that damage their environments far less. For that reason, that argument clearly stands. But let's briefly talk about why this increases the likelihood of state capture by multinational corporations. Because developing states often are at a negotiating disadvantage for reasons that are well explained at first affirmative. So this gives multinational corporations a lot of power. For instance, now they can pay after, before, and they can come in, employ workers, and then say later on, actually, I'm going to lie out my profit through a shell corporation so I don't have to pay your tax. I can threaten to leave because I'm paying your workers. Your workers be unemployed, lower your tax. You can do things like extract concession so that you can maximize that profit. They suggest that there'll be no competition, so this will drive down costs. But as I already established, the profit is lucrative enough, the lower cost of operating in a developing country are enough, which is why you have enough competition for these places to enter and for the prices to be set reasonably high. In their world, state capture is far more likely. For that reason, crowd to the game.
I think the first thing.
Good to go.
Yes.
Sorry, let me just get my timer up.
It is almost certainly never a winning strategy for teams to argue that businesses do not want to make profit, that they would forego their fiduciary duty to their shareholders, to the debts they owe, forego the chance of getting a bonus, forego the chance of being on Forbes or whatever, forego the amount of capital that they could accrue from profit, simply for the reason that they now lose 20% of that profit back. This team acknowledges that that is a strange strategy, and then they do not defend it. They do not defend that that would be a rational choice for any business to do. We think it is not. 3 things. First, quality of deals, because this gets little response, and it's obviously incredibly important. Second, quality of profits. Third, on the interaction and the environment. First, on quality of deals, what do we explain here? We explain that on both sides there's a power asymmetry between the developing country and the MNC. They obviously don't contest this, it's just true. But what we explain is that power asymmetry actualizes more under their side than ours. For the reason that A, often the information provided to do things like calculate the fixed cost is biased, is done by BP engineers. They can estimate the amount of profit they make and lie about it. Obviously that gives power to write deals that do not credit the amount of profit BP will actually make. But secondly, I would suggest an extra substantive that presumably they have more ability to take bad offers under your side, because often states have incentives to maximize the profit they get right away, because they have electoral incentives to spend it all very quickly in gaining support. Obviously that means they're more likely to take those deals where they get a short-term upfront cost rather than dragging out the negotiating process. On the outside, they can't do that. They would wait to get a better deal that gets them more profit in the long term. What do they say here? 2 things. First, they explain that this is an irrational way to determine profit. My first question is, why is this a harm? This is an active debate. It is unproven that these developing countries actually care about the rationality of the way to get profit. Obviously, this is profit that goes to their people, is infrastructure for their people. Presumably, they care about that more than the rationality of the way they get it. But the second thing I know is I flip this, because I would actually say that fixed rates do scale with the amount of destruction you do, whereas the first upfront cost does not matter how much you actually end up doing. Our one does scale with externalities. royalties, because our side is the one where the more extraction you do and the more money you make from it, the more you get taxed. That is one that does scale with negative externalities if you do care about it. The second thing they say is you get more agency when you are taking costs from someone at the start, rather than when you allow them in and then take costs from the throughout the process. It's unproven that you actually get more agency here. It's unclear to me why that is a greater form of agency on both sides who are choosing to allow someone in. In fact, we think deals are better on our side. The important corollary of that point is that if deals are better, if you're making a greater fixed percentage under our side and a smaller lump sum cost under their side, our side is the one where you make more profit initially. So if you're confused about the profit point, this will take you towards side affirmative. Second question then, the quality and distribution of profits. I'm going to break this up, as said, into first the amount of profits you make and second distribution. First, on amount of profits you make. We suggest two things. First, there are extra firms that are going in because they do not have to pay the upfront costs. That is, you do not have to be as large as BP, you don't have to be a mega firm. But second, there is more competition. What do they say? They say two things. First, they say firms will be less likely to want profit. And then they say, well, this is a strange, this might seem intuitively strange that firms might not want profit, and then don't provide a reason why it is the case. They simply say, yes, they will seek profit, but they'll do it in a less risky way, which is a different argument. That is not defending the original statement, it is moving on to a second one. They do not defend that firms would actually be willing to forego profit. It is unclear to me why this is such a high rate that it is taking profitability from zero from what you're making money. Note these companies make significant amount of money, BP and Shell, consistently topping the profitability charts, that taking 20% of that off the top is actually much lower. It's also unclear to me that the initial cost that you have to recoup material we give you at Jez is not something that would also factor into those calculations. It's unclear to me that the profit is actually much worse under their side. But what they then run away into to try and defend is that, well, you would want more certain profit rather than riskier profit. Four problems with this. First, these are multinational companies, as we explained, which means they're aggressively diversified. That means they operate in a variety of different countries at once. They have a stockpile of cash. The important corollary out of that is that they therefore do not care particularly about creating a certain amount of risk in one of their investments, creating risk in one area. They're presumably happy to accumulate the cost of that risk in another area. They do not contend the characterization that these are huge, giant corporations that can take the loss of a risky profit. So they're probably diversified enough, this doesn't change their behavior. Second, I don't think there's enough proof in that speech to explain why these more certain forms of profit are actually drastically worse than the more risky forms of profit. That is, they give you some examples of things that might be bad forms of profit that are certain, and other that might be good forms of profit that are risky. But there are also many other risky things to do that would also be incredibly bad for the environment. That is, extracting a whole new mine in somewhere that you might think there would be profit is probably an incredibly risky thing to do that is really bad for you. Same it's analysis on both sides. It's unclear to me why they actually prove that. Third thing is it's actually unclear the amount of risk that you would have to take on, because profits usually tend to be relatively certain for the reason that you have a good amount of analysis of what's in the ground. Obviously, you might increase or decrease that risk marginally, but it's unclear that it's enough of a risk to actually change your behavior in meaningful ways. So that explains why the amount of profit is larger on side affirmative, where we have, as we explained, more firms investing and we make more money from them. Second thing is on distribution of profits. So at about 7:30, they say, well, now you're going to take over and control the state, or at least you'll have a significant amount of leverage over them. But the problem with this is most of their ways of that states with these multinational corporations that abuse states are things that are actively quite illegal and things that are actively quite easy to prove, like not fulfilling your obligation in the contract to pay back. And they say, well, you can put it in shell companies, but obviously you still need to have the money flowing into the government from something connected to that company. Obviously, that is illegal. It's also something that's incredibly bad for your reputation as BP or Shell, someone that needs to negotiate with that country again for your other mines, someone that needs to negotiate with similar countries. Obviously, unlikely to do it. But I would also introduce new substantive here in two ways. First, I would wash the issue of corruption, because I'd suggest that the big lump sum payment they give you is actually a harm, because lump sum payments often are the things that are used to skim off the top for corruption, because they're so hard to audit because there's so many of them. That's what caused the 1MDB scandal in Malaysia, when you had a huge amount of resource rent profits in one time that you funnel into sovereign wealth fund and then extract out. Second thing is you actually get more sustainable investment under our side for the reason that you don't get one lump sum, which because of electoral incentives, you want to use up all at once. Instead, when you're getting that money trickling in, you have a greater incentive to invest it because you know that it's going to be trickling in over time. That's important because it means you can make long-term, more sustainable investments. That is new substantive, it's incredibly important. Final issue then, quality of extraction, that is the impact on the environment. What do we tell you here? First, And when you want to recoup your debts, that is when you have incurred a huge amount of debt by paying that lump sum cost. You're therefore going to extract as quickly as possible because you have a short time frame to repay them. Second, and I'm going to explain this is new, you often get better quality of firms on the outside for the reason that A, they're often domestic, that is upfront cost thing means that domestic firms can now get into the market. That's incredibly important because they're more responsive to the local market, and if they make money, that money is much more directly flowing back to them rather than to BP executives in Britain. But secondly, the firms are probably, if they're smaller, have less social capital to avoid repercussions for destroying the environment. That is, if you're not as big as BP, you don't have as much lobbying power, you can't run away from accusations of environmental damage, you cannot cover things up as easily, you cannot corral the media as easily. So, environmental damage is better for our firms because they are firms that are more accountable. What do they say here? Two things. First, they say sometimes the profitability that is certain versus risky dynamic leads you to make bad investments. But they never explain that this is the likelihood. They just simply give you examples here. It's never explained why the more risky ones are certain to be worse for the environment. Second, they say sometimes you should compensate people. But this is where our material, our distribution plays in. Because if you're doing more sustainable development, that is better compensation. That is better in the long term. At the end of this debate, what are you going to know? Very simply, under our side, you have better deals, you make more money off them, and you get a better environment for our proposed.
The reason why we don't defend the claim that companies don't want to make a profit is because, yeah, that's not the argument. Instead, we make quite an interesting, clever, and elegant argument that companies do act in their interests, and this affirmative team perversely changes their interests. What ways do they change it in? Well, first and foremost, they literally just mean that the more land you use, you are not, like, the amount of tax you pay does not increase unless your profits increase. Think about this for a second. A mining company that mines more hectares of land but is less profitable than a mining company which mines less hectares of land but is more profitable, the first one pays less tax on their side. And that is obviously bad because it's on their side. The literal land use, the cubic meters or whatever of coal extracted, have more externalities occur. Externalities do not come from being efficient, from deriving profit. They come from digging shit up out of the ground. Alright, 3 things in this speech. Firstly, why the quantity of investment does fall to our side. Secondly, why quantity is just less important than quality. And finally, why we clearly win on quality. Firstly, on quantity. Their claim essentially is that they just get more investment on their side because, like, essentially that there are high setup costs and having to pay royalties in addition to those setup costs deter companies from coming in. There are 2 claims that come from that. The first is to suggest that try and push those setup costs down, which results in, I think, the second set of harms. All of those are contingent on that first premise. But then the other thing they say, which notably is intention, is that this just deters companies from coming in. It's quite unclear at this point in the debate, I think, whether or not they have no companies or whether those companies just file the price down. I think they need to clarify that at third. However, I think there are a series of problems with this argument just empirically. The first thing to say is that, as they characterize right from the first speaker, resource extraction is an extremely reliable source of income. And the kinds of firms that are involved in it are very large MNCs, and that characterization does not work for their side, because it literally just explains why these firms are extremely liquid and extremely able to get loans. Like, their borrowing power is very high, which explains that it is, like, given that they are already paying pretty high setup costs, given that they're already buying a lot of land, it is, I think, really unclear why they can't afford royalties in addition. They just don't do enough analysis to explain why this is the tipping point, so to speak, on their capacity to engage in these industries. I think it's very likely that they can get a loan for that. The other thing to say, though, is just that, regardless of the price of tax, there's just huge gains of operating in developing countries for these companies. Notably, that wages are pretty low comparatively, and that means that you're able to extract quite a lot of additional profit on the cost of labor and then also the cost of consumer products that come from that labor. That explains that these countries have a competitive advantage, I think, on either side of the house. It is very unlikely that this tax is decisive in terms of a company's interest in going into these countries. I guess I would just note also that most Western countries, like Norway or the state of Western Australia, charge royalties on their resources, which should probably suggest to you that if you have other, clearly, this is not, economically irrational for developed states. It's very unclear why it would be for developing states. However, I'm actually just also going to flip this and suggest that for the most competitive firms, royalties are a particularly attractive model of tax. And that's just for the reason that if you know that you have a particularly good capacity to make a profit, not being taxed on that additional profit is appealing to you. So perhaps for shitter firms that aren't particularly efficient, yes, maybe royalties are more of a disincentive, but for the best and most competitive firms, they are more profitable for these companies, because they can make profit on top of that royalty. Their other claim is that these firms will work to push down the price of royalties, and they give a couple of reasons. I've already explained that this appears to be at a bit of tension, but I also just want to note that it is clearly at least symmetrical. Like, if you have the capacity to push down royalties, you obviously have the political capacity to push down taxes. And I think that it's just easier to do things like evade taxes. There are very complex systems of international tax evasion that are much less visible, much easier to do than just like than trying to exert power on states. But the other thing I would say is just the reason why there isn't competition between companies that means that you don't do this. It makes no sense. They're like, well, resource companies are territorial, so they won't compete for each individual country. Guys, they're not cats. Like, why are they territorial? Totally unexplained. Obviously, there's a bit of land, it's got some resources, different countries will make bids, and they describe that when they explain that they're making deals. If you're fucking negotiating, obviously there is competition. That made no fucking sense. So, at the end of this, they just don't do the analytical work to explain why this is such a deterrent to investment. So you can assume that probably the amount of investment is pretty similar, but on our side, we're positively incentivizing the best firms to invest, so we're ahead of this culture. The next thing to say though is just that quantity is much less important in this debate than quality. And that's because, firstly, the amount of investment needs to be used well for it to be a benefit for this team. If it is used for things like environmental exploitation, if it is used for things like state capture, it is very unclear to me that that is a benefit, and those negative externalities should somewhat outweigh the quantity they describe. But the other thing to say is it's just contingent on getting your hands on the benefits in the first place, which is why the stuff we tell you at Oscar about tax evasion is very important. If you are just able to offshore profits quite easily, if you are just able to lie about profits, which, yes, like obviously a degree of corruption is a bit symmetrical, but I think it's easier in the case of tax. I quite clearly explained and insufficiently responded to. That means that the amount of investment increasing is insufficient to win the debate. That means that you should weigh quality a lot higher, and I think we give a series of really good reasons why quality of investment falls to us. Firstly, we explained that it creates perverse incentives in profit seeking, and like the complexity of this argument, which I really like, is just so not responded to in that second affirmative speech. Like, it makes me quite sad, because this argument is really quite clever, right? We explained that there are a series of good investments that are like structurally more speculative or risky for firms, and that is capital investment. And the structural reason for this, if you like want a structural reason, is obviously there's costs involved. Like, there's an upfront cost that down the track pays off. Like, that is why structurally good investment is likely to be more speculative. But we tell you that you are less likely to do this because your like willingness to take on cost, like the curve moves inward at the point where the amount of tax you can pay on your profit is higher. So the trade-off you make as a company is like, well, we could put this money into refining our lithium more efficiently, but we know that whatever profit we make from that will potentially outweigh the degree, like our capacity to invest in it. So you do things like squeeze labor, you do things like cut environmental, costs. They are like, well, we don't know, maybe some cost cutting is good and some investment is bad. But I think like clearly in the majority of cases it is better for firms to take the risky investments that improve their production process. They needed to respond to that a lot better. But we give you two other pieces of material. We explain that you lose out on a big incentive to efficiency. That is to say, if you are taxing the amount of stuff, land, whatever it is people are extracting, clearly their incentive is to use it more efficiently and not be wasteful. They just wholly fail to respond to this. They counter-assert that they're the ones who internalize externalities. No, you didn't respond to our reasons why we did that. You have to do that to win this debate. Finally, we give you state capture on two levels. We explain that this deters transitions away from things that are very profitable like coal, and we explain that profit-seeking companies are able to negotiate extractions, things like cheap water or cheap labor, in order to promise a profit down the line. They're like, well, you can skim money off the top of big royalties. What type of corruption is worse? Systematically changing states' energy policies, or a government official pocketing some money? Clearly the former. Their claims are lazy. They're mostly contingent on their quantity made anyway, but then they're like, these states will make bad deals to make money in the short term. It's unclear to me that they even have this power on a market, which is what they're defending, but also it's just so paternalistic. They give you a bunch of reasons why they have good incentives. Elections don't just happen once, they happen down the line. Clearly they have long-term incentives. Then they're like, well, we get competition. Mines are excludable, right? So like on both sides, firms are competing, but you don't have a bunch of firms in the one area, so that made no sense. Then they're like, well, you're gonna mine more quickly to pay back your debts. Why is this bad? They just don't explain why that's polluting at all. I think efficiency is probably good. At the end of this, I think they make almost no attempt to win the quality clash, to be honest. We have a series of interesting economic mechanisms that are poorly responded to, and the only push, which is about quantity, simply does not work. So proud to shoot the game.
Starting in 3, 2. Two issues in this speech. First of all, on efficiency and quality. Second of all, on corruption. Before I do that, I'll make one observation at the start of the speech, which is that the inflation material is new as per Affirmative, and it's wrong for the reason that they don't prove why this is a substantial increase in the amount of GDP such to cause inflation. That response is deleted. So, let's go into the issues in this speech. Firstly, on resource imbalance. They say that in their world it is harder to push deals down, but obviously we describe ways in which this can occur symmetrically, which is later considered down the bench. Therefore, the question you must ask is, in what world is this more likely to occur? And the only reason that they give is that in our world there are incredibly high start-up costs, and that then flows on to all the benefits they give about competition, about the amount of investment. So what I will do in this speech is I will comprehensively defeat that premise, and then take out the, thing that all of the impacts rest on, right? So, I think 8 reasons to believe why this is wrong. First reason, which I guess has 4 sub-reasons, is the loans that MNCs require are very easy to get. Some of which is already established in Cat's speech, because it's got inelastic demand, because there's lots of data on the amount of resources that are there, because this is an established practice, and because justifying investments for startup costs are far, far easier than justifying long-run projections of investment costs, because the time frame over which you have to make a prediction is smaller, and therefore there's less uncertainty surrounding profits into the long run, which is an explanation to believe that companies are likely to get loans, which I would note is their main push for why there will not be a lot of competition, for why startup costs are high, and for why therefore on our world firms won't come in. The second thing I would outline though is that often MNCs, even if they are a mid-level MNC, which I don't give an example of and don't exist for structural reasons, but assume it exists, are often very liquid because A, I just proved that they can get access to lots of loans, but B, have other operations which justify them going in and taking all of this stuff. So it was ridiculous to believe that people couldn't go in. The third response though is that, which is what I already explained I guess, is that if, it's easier to justify giving more for startup costs than it is to, for example, giving a little bit less but having much more uncertainty into the long run with respect to what level of tax bracket you will fall into. So that would suggest that it's actually a flip on their original claim, which means if you believe what they're describing as the harm in the debate, it occurs asymmetrically to their side. But the fourth response, which is given at Ellie, which I think is awesome, is resources are geographically located in one place. There are not 6 different mines going into the one coal area in Burkina Faso that compete over deals initially. Their competition mechanism suggests that there are lots of people mining in the same place, which is ridiculous. So, we've established so far in this speech that the competition mechanism is not important. What does that do for the debate? Firstly, it means that the win strategy that they outline, which is that you cannot go, we get substantially better deals and all that, doesn't really make sense anymore. But it also activates a lot of weighing for our side. Because if you don't believe that we get the same amount of deals as them, you only need to believe that we get sufficiently similar deals, because then it activates all of our weighing about the quality of these deals. Because we explain that governments can do far more planning, we explain that you are likely to get investment into much better things, we explain that you reward companies for being efficient and not over-exploiting the land, which are all things that they are unable to deal with, and they attempt to outweigh by increasing the margin on this issue, which they now have not done. So, let's now talk about the efficiency push that we give you. We essentially explain that corporations are often faced with difficult decisions because they can continue doing shitty practices that are stable, or they can invest in things that might be a little bit risky, that might make them more profit and then push them into a higher tax bracket that will ultimately mean they end up losing more money. The first response, which gets booted by Ellie, is, but corporations want to make more money, they misunderstand the argument. The correct responses come out at Cat. What Cat says, first of all, you have protections against these sorts of things because you have other operations going on. But the problem with this is that their own fiduciary responsibility material suggests why this is wrong. A fiduciary responsibility is not make as much money as possible, do everything crazy. It's protect the interests of the corporation, which structurally explains then why they will never opt for the riskier investment, why they will always cut the wage practices, why they will always lobby to never increase the efficiency of plantations, and they will just do more degradation of the environment. The second response they give is that you don't want to invest in a lot of new technology or upgrade power plants simply because it costs a lot of money and they would never make this decision, which is a complex way of explaining the generic response, which is, if this was profitable, why wouldn't they do it anyway? But we explain that corporations know that this is profitable, but aren't certain about the impacts, which is why this response doesn't make sense. So, let's now talk about corruption. Actually, before I talk about corruption, I just want to explain that, the way that we actually win this debate is fairly simple, right? Because unless you believe that one side gets absolutely drastically better deals in things like investment, then they just cannot win. And I'll knock out their corruption material in a minute, which they spend a lot of time weighing and pivoting to a third. But realistically, we explain a series of ways in which the deals are better for the people there, for the corporations, and for the long-term interests of the country structurally, which means the only way they could outweigh this is by proving there's substantially more influx of capital, which they are not able to do. Let's then talk about corruption. Their claim is that corruption is asymmetrically worse on our side for the reason that it's, kind of bad when governments do it. And they say, well, what about in electoral cycles when you want to spend lots of money? Well, in an electoral cycle, why would you engage in huge amounts of corruption that your opposition has an incentive to call you out for? Doesn't seem particularly likely in my opinion. But this is such a, silly interpretation of how countries work and so paternalistic. It requires you to believe that countries are not able to do anything like long-term planning, like governments don't care about re-electability, like governments don't have an interest to, engage rationally with the money they're given, for example. I will concede that there might be 1 or 2 civil servants who will take some money off the top. I will even concede that, for example, there are some corrupt governments in the world, but this is still better for us because A, this never addresses the more likely situation of when governments are good, but B, think about the actor that is doing corruption in this debate, because they say it's governments and governments are worse, which I've explained is not true. And we explain corporations are far more likely to engage in corruption. They not only have a greater incentive, but they have a greater capacity. By God, I love BP debating. So, 4 responses as to why corporations do this worse. First of all, they have way more resources and bargaining power, which is conceded by them, which means they're more likely to engage in it. Secondly, they have the biggest incentive to do this because they've already mined and created all the profit. There's less blowback for them. Thirdly, all the avenues of legal resource they describe are not open to them. For example, they can just threaten to move, which isn't illegal, and they've already exploited all of the land and they're structurally reliant upon that, company being there. Secondly, they say, oh guys, it's illegal to, sell it all to a shareholder or a shell company or whatever. Yeah, so they don't prove they have access to sufficient legal mechanisms to then go and challenge them. Shell corporations are notoriously difficult for being able to catch. Not an explanation. They say, but BP cares about its reputation. Not explain. And secondly, even if you believe that it occurs to some extent, not explain why they care about the reputation at the expense of huge amounts of profit, which if you buy their characterization that they are affirm that this is all they care about, would suggest this mechanism is wrong. The third thing they say is, well, what about domestic corporations? The response is 1, unclear they exist in many instances because of the poor conditions they describe. 2, well, if they're poorer and they have less technology, they're often worse. They have to overexploit the environment because they're less efficient. They cannot make as much profit, they cannot do as much reinvestment, they do not provide as much jobs. Not an explanation as to why this is a better comparative. But finally, these are the firms that are least likely to be able to meet the startup costs in the first place that they describe are so ridiculously high. So if you credit their first argument, you can't then credit the way they attempt to win the second argument. What should you believe at the end of this speech? On corruption, who is the worst actor to do it? Probably firms that already got everything out of the deal and had a lot of established ways to get around corruption, then governments, which by their own setup should be in the interest of the people. And if you're confused about what deals occur, we don't have to win it by a landslide, we just have to be sufficiently similar or better to them to outweigh them on quality. We'll take the debate.
Reply.
At this point in the debate, why would you vote for the affirmative team? I guess your primary reason would be you somehow believe they win an issue that you're going to label distribution of profit, which is the term the affirmative team is using in this debate to group a bunch of arguments that I don't think are that tightly related, but I'll respond to them all in tandem in case you believe they're related. First is essentially one on government corruption, which is to say, well, this incentivizes government corruption because it gives them lump sums, which is essentially made, I think, entirely by an assertion in the late stages of second affirmative, where we claim that it's more, you get a lump sum, you get something straightforwardly that you can predict, and Jack's response is just say, well, you'll skim things off the top, and that will fund government corruption. Unfortunately, this didn't respond to the actual claim, which is that, well, that's pretty good to be able to finance programs as a developing country well, even if the actor isn't always the government. It's good for the developing country where their government has fucking money to spend on shit. But we would suggest that at the end of this debate, the developing countries probably on net have good incentives for the government to do things, which means our claim that it's more likely that exploitation happens and corruption happens when multinational corporations enter, hire people, start extracting, and then have to pay later, as we tell you from first, and can extract the kinds of concessions that we explained to you quite neatly, I think, at second negative. So, that argument is flipped. They then make this claim that there'll be more domestic companies, which appears to be essentially relying on the claim that they will be able to compete more because there will be less companies coming in. But I don't think there's ever a full explanation of why we want these domestic companies to succeed. Like, they can often be more corrupt, they can often exploit low competition quite perniciously. That explanation is not given. But if that means we lose efficiency, i.e. more extraction, less efficient, that's a bad thing, that's harm. They then suggest that there's greater leverage to, and this is primarily made in first affirmative, for exploitative contracts between governments and MNCs to arise, but I don't think this is impacted particularly stunningly. I do just think though, we successfully flip whatever impact it's going for. We at worst have explained that it's symmetric by explaining, well, obviously the fact that these are highly liquid corporations with high access to loans, and the fact, as given at first affirmative, it's an incredibly lucrative industry they're relying on, probably do have the capacity to at least make the upfront payment. Which means exploitative contracts are just more likely in their world, where you can negotiate later and accrue the harm that we described down the bench. Or if it's just domestic companies operating in a setting of low competition and are able to benefit from that low competition to exploit in ways that are unproductive. But maybe the other way is you believe they want a clash label which royalties corporations exploit land in developing countries more. And I think we win this clash comfortably because the entirety of the affirmative bench decided to respond to my speech by responding to the executive summary of the argument given before I explained the actual mechanism, and not responding to the actual mechanism, which was, as we have gone to great painstaking measures to explain down the bench, is capital-intensive investments to increase profit are less likely because they're more speculative. It's far more likely you do less intensive things. Labor cost shrinking, that is not speculative, that doesn't have upfront costs, which has massive harms on the exploitation of labor. That's bad for laborers in developing countries who get paid less. It's bad for labor conditions in the labor market generally. It's bad for the developing countries' fucking goods and common goods like water, which get polluted far more because of more environmentally harmful corporations that don't have the incentive to make their operations more efficient and environmentally sustainable, which outweighs, because at worst it's the same friggin' harms that they're talking about in the distribution of profit argument, and it trickles out because less profit, corporations need less investment in the country overall, which means we've comfortably won this debate. The easiest way to understand that is we incentivize companies that are the most efficient, that have the greatest capacity to increase their operations, have the largest scale of profit that's actually good for the environment and for the economy. For that reason, we were proud to negate. You should stand with us.
Let's firstly begin with corruption. Firstly, this is a wash, as Jack explained. It's because it's hard to audit the influx of profits. They don't respond to this particular mechanism or the documents that are part of why is it that we can keep non-corruption at bay on their side. But secondly, I think, as we explained at first, this is quite unlikely on both sides, because governments will care about, in the end, the interest of its population. They don't impact this problem of corruption properly, especially when, yes, governments have an incentive to do corruption, but governments also have an incentive to help the population. I have an incentive to maybe shit on this table, but it's unclear why the incentive to not shit on this table does not override that. They do not weigh those incentives. And thirdly, they don't impact it even if it were to occur. Like, what is corruption? They say it's offshoring profits. They say it's state capture. This is a wishy-washy harm. What does this mean? Because state capture to me sounds like if a state has agreed with the corporation to do X thing, this sounds like a negotiation or a deal. They do not explain the gravity of this corruption argument. You cannot win in the debate. Let's talk about quantity of investment. We give you a number of reasons why the quantity of investment going up is very important. That is because you get people through the door, especially MNCs that are particularly reticent. They say, well, you know, at third negative, well, there aren't that high startup costs in the status quo, so there's already a lot of competition in the people who want to have a deal with the government. But the problem is that they don't ask what an ordinary intelligent voter would ask, which is just like, can startup costs and also the fixed fee this team has deter a corporation from competing to extract in a nation? Can it do that? The answer is probably yes, because sometimes shareholders can be reticent, even though extraction can be lucrative. It is possible that given that it's a fixed cost, that maybe your profits don't match that some quarters, which therefore means that you don't get profits, you instead work at a loss. So you have to ask yourself, given that there are some incentives to not invest at times, Should we maybe change the way that we have people think about investing in certain countries? We get more people in the door to start discussing deals and tenders with these governments. And even if we just get one more corporation, whether that be a domestic one or a slightly weaker multinational corporation from abroad, that is a win in this debate. Because now the government can do what it wasn't able to do before, which is play those stakeholders off against each other, get and extract the best deals and the best contracts for the betterment of its population. And that is maybe a slim benefit, but a slim benefit to a population in a developing nation is massive. And that is why we win. They try to weigh this away by saying the quality of investment argument is so important. This is where Ellie diverges from the ordinary intelligent voter. You might be super clever and smart, but no one understands what your argument is about. They say that corporations will behave more riskily and speculatively. Firstly, you need to prove that a lack of riskiness in extraction is a bad thing. Like, they don't explain what the harm actually is when you extract in a certain way that is known and maybe is not as risky. They don't explain the problem. But secondly, you need to prove that there's an imperative for your ability to try and change riskiness. That is, that you don't explain why this is exclusive. Firstly, under our side at CAT, we explain that profit matches negative externalities. That is, that if you want to be risky, you can be riskier under our side. Because if you do not make profit in being risky, you don't get taxed that much. So why wouldn't you just do it? And also, secondly, they don't explain why the machines aren't used under our side if they're so awesome. Like, if they're so profitable, why aren't they being done in the status quo on both sides? This is a wash. But the third problem with this argument is that they needed to prove that riskiness occurs, because at CAT, we explain that the fixed fee deters your ability to be riskiness because you want to inspire confidence in shareholders and everyone that you will always match the issue of the fixed fee. You will match all of your debts, which is the reason why you can't be risky. But also, what is this riskiness? They say it's machines. What is that? It's such a wishy-washy argument. What is specifically are you changing? And you've got to weigh that in the debate. An ordinary intelligent voter is not persuaded by something that may not happen, something that is in the air, something that is not important. Compare that to maybe extracting a few more extra dollars from a corporation, which goes into the mouths of a domestic population, and we give you incentives why governments would do that. If you cast your ballot for them, you cast your ballot for dreams and fantasies. Yes, we have very small benefits, but they are concrete benefits, and they actually matter.